So we are now live with the July 3rd meeting of the Node.js modules team and joined by a number of my colleagues here for us to discuss, whatever we have on the agenda. And so we have one item on the agenda right now, although there's something else that I think we should discuss as well. I'm just dropping the doc into the chat, and please add your name to the agenda doc for the purposes of just kind of like keeping track of attendance. The one issue that we have on here right now is package exports, which is number 341. But what I think we should maybe also look into, at least discussing, is what's the OJ harp? Jordan has a pull request on core to put all modules into a namespace. But I think that we should discuss that one quickly as well, because it does actually affect us. I believe that there's a new pull request related to modules that Gus opened that is slightly blocking this. Let me just find it. Number 28466. Thank you for being patient with me while I do this live. Okay, so and then Jordan has joined us. Great. So package.exports, which is modules issue 341. I believe that that a pull request has been opened. Just for review, let me get that here. I'm just dropping it in the chat. And so Guy has gone through, he's implemented the proposal, the exports portion of it, not the imports portion of it. This seems to include documentation, the implementation, and some basic tests as well. So I think that this is maybe ready to start going upstream. The one thing that I pushed back on was about like including the ability to do dot for an alias for the export of the main. Guy has just joined us. Wes is mentioning that VHS added support for synthetic modules, which are allowed to throw during export setup, which has some questions about the original dynamic modules proposal. Wes, are you talking about the proposal that we had made to TC39? Okay, let's add that too for a discussion point, because maybe that's a good reason to bring it back to the committee. Guy, we were just talking about your exports proposal PR number 72. Do you want to discuss it really quickly? Maybe give an intro.
Sure. Yeah, it's really just bringing back the work that we had on that previously, and I think most of the features are in line with what we've discussed. Mappings, specific subpaths within a package, as well as folders within a package, and then there's just a few sort of edge cases as well that could be worth discussing. For example, supporting the dot for the main, whether there should be a Boolean property and how that's treated, and various things like that. There is one other thing I was thinking as well that could be worth discussing, which is when you have the main field in the package JSON, you can choose whether you want to have the leading dot / or not. And I'm wondering if maybe we should make it optional for exports as well, so that when you define exports, whether you start with a dot / or not could be optional, but I'm open to discussion on that as well.
Jordan has their hand up.
Yeah, so there are two little things. So I made a small comment on the PR, which we can talk about on the PR and not in the meeting if you want, but I wanted to just bring it out. Like, I think we should be careful when we define the effective schema for this field, that it recognize the reality that there are no controls on what can go in this JSON field in the actual ecosystem. And so we'll want to figure out what the behavior should be when a package I don't control has a malformed value in the fields, and like when it makes sense to essentially deny me the ability to use that package versus when it makes sense to fall back to some different behavior. And then the second item was, I guess, a response to what you just said. I think that the dot and the slash and stuff are optional in main right now, and I think also in bin. But that's super confusing, and that also only works because none of them go to bare identifiers. Like, you can't have a bare identifier there. So so even if they required the dot slash, main and bin would have probably had to throw, so that you couldn't make your main be one of your like node modules packages. So given that, I feel like it's a mistake that we shouldn't repeat to make them optional. I think that since since they shouldn't be bare identifiers, that it's clearer to essentially throw when the dot and the slash, when the dot isn't there, basically, because then it avoids the current situation with main and bin, where the intention of the user is not necessarily clear, even if the semantics are.
Jordan, to respond to your comment on the well-formed field, I'm happy to work that out in the issue queue with you, and maybe we can come up with some well-defined semantics there. And a point certainly taken on the being explicit about the pathing. I guess there's also a certain visual cue that comes with making sure that the dot// are used, which could be useful to users so that they truly understand what it is that they're mapping and that there isn't any confusion there. So I can get behind both of those.
Cool. Yeah, and we can have further discussions on the PR or whoever. Just wanted to raise them so that the group has heard them.
Jan, you have your hand up?
Yeah. I'm obviously always in favor of the more explicit and more clear option. So, for example, exports values having dot slash at the beginning. The only reason why I think we should be careful with that is because of the existing main field. Like, especially if, like, the way that the current semantics works, it's basically that exports is a pretty straightforward extension of the main field, or the main field becomes just randomly one of the exports fields, which means that we would have a main field that is basically the same, but works differently than all the others, which is also kind of confusing. So if we disallow the traditional main field values that don't have a leading dot slash, I think we should definitely be careful that we have a very good error message. Like, hey, this is exactly where it's wrong. Here's the most likely thing you meant, kind of deal.
A clear error message sounds great to me, regardless.
So at a higher level, if we were to take the PR as it currently exists, what changes would we want to see to move it to be an upstream pull request? Jan?
I think giving the precedence, we would want it to be flagged behind a dedicated flag, or do we think that this is close enough to a consensus already that we don't need an individual flag?
Jordan,
I think it, yeah. Oh, go ahead, Miles.
please go for it.
So just to respond to that question, I think that this is a sort of, like, we're aiming to get this behavior in both CommonJS and ESM, and this is the sort of behavior that, like, kind of needs to be by default. Otherwise, someone's package isn't going to work the way they expect. So I think that unless someone has consensus to the general approach, it seems like, maybe except for a brief tryout period, it seems prudent to get it unflagged as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. Like, let's get it in, let's get it behind a flag, and then start iterating on it. Jordan, would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah,
of what you're saying?
but I'd like to see it unflagged, like, long before, or rather not on the same schedule as unflagging ESM. I think that it should exist on its own as a feature, unrelated to ESM. It just also happens to work really nicely with an ESM implementation.
Guy, is there a way to do this for CommonJS that can be done in a way that's not semver major?
I think it should be additive for CommonJS. The thing there is just to, because effectively we have two separate resolvers, the CommonJS resolver and the ESM resolver. So it would be a separate piece of work to bring it into the CommonJS resolver. But it should be, in theory, relatively straightforward. I'm sure we'll probably discover things as we dig into that. Yeah. So right now it's just being applied in the ESM resolver and not the CommonJS resolver. So we should maybe discuss that. And in theory, it shouldn't be that difficult to add to the CommonJS resolver.
So it seems to me like it might make sense to open this behind a flag and then separately have a separate pull request implementing it for CommonJS and then work towards unflagging it. Does that seem reasonable?
Sounds great to me.
Cool. Guy, are you feeling like you know exactly what to do next?
So I have very limited time at the moment. So whether I'll be able to also implement the CommonJS resolver part is the only thing that I'm uncertain of. But I mean, if we can get it in flagged, and then, if we're looking at a sort of a 2 months sort of buffer here, then I'm sure I could have a look at it within that time.
Okay, well, I think that, like, if we open it on core, we can at least get the feedback from upstream, and we can find out if maybe there's extra hoops that they would like us to jump through. Does that make sense?
Sure, I'd be glad to open it on core.
Okay, great. So I think that wraps up this discussion, unless anyone else has something to add. And then, Guy, just to be clear, would you be removing the dot for main alias?
I can remove it. If we're unsure about it, we can remove it for now and then add it back. What do people think?
Well, for CommonJS, it would have to point to the main, right? I mean, because that's what dot means. It means do a resolve in this directory, which goes to the main or index and follows extension lookup. Like, it's fine if in ESM it doesn't look at the main. We can debate that separately, but, like, I think in CommonJS that's the only thing it can do.
So Oh, someone has their hand up. Jan?
Yeah, so my vote would definitely be to remove it from exports. And the reason is that dot and main are exactly the same thing. So like it's the exact same thing that they map. So having both seems just dangerous and confusing because either people will randomly use one or the other, so it's just two places you have to check, or people will accidentally put two different values into both and then it will break or get confusing error messages. So I think just disallowing dot specifically in exports makes sense because that means main is here to stay. That's the thing that people know. That is how they map this part. And it also gets rid of what some people have considered a somewhat confusing property key, which is just a dot, which is not as evocative as dot slash something.
Jordan?
Yeah, so I commented about what about the case of, like, let's say I do dot slash test slash dot dot. Like literally any path, any convoluted path that results in resolving to the folder, which will hit the package JSON, will hit the main. So like, but banning the dot is a nice syntactic convenience. But if we are attempting, yeah, so like what Wes's reply, like it's if we actually are trying to say we don't want main to be duplicated in exports, then we need to actually say that the fully resolved key in the exports object can't map to, like, can't hit that package JSON or something to that effect. And if we're prepared to say that, then fine. That sounds good.
You bring up
sense to me.
You bring up another interesting point there, Jordan, and that's that we also haven't considered what our permitted, it's effectively like URL validations are. For example, I believe somewhere we have a rule that actually doesn't allow dot and dot dot. I forget exactly which code path it is. I think it might be in the file URL to path stuff. We've got some checks like that sort of thing. But we could potentially have a validation that says if you have a dot dot or a dot in your target, it's going to throw a validation error, and then you won't be able to backtrack to the.
But then there's symlinks. So there's just the reality is that I think that the keys should be fully resolved, just like the browser field is, which has a spec. And I think that if the keys, like, and it knows no kind of naive restrictions on the string values in the keys are actually going to stop the edge cases. And it's fine if we want to add those restrictions for ergonomics reasons, but I think that we still need to be actually checking whatever the fully resolved path is, if that's something we want to restrict. And I think, again, it's fine if we want to say nothing can resolve to this package JSON in the exports field, but we actually have to resolve it to find that out. We can't, like, we can ban dot dot or just dot by itself, and we can have a nice error message in those cases, sure. But like, I really think we have to hit the full actual resolve path.
Yeah, and then the other side of that is, do we want to allow things like absolute paths on the right-hand side, etc.? So there are these kind of right-hand side and left-hand side spaces, and we could restrict to subsets.
What we could also do, though, real quick, is we could restrict the left-hand side to not resolve to that package JSON. We could also restrict the right-hand side to resolve to something that is within the folder that contains that package JSON, meaning you can't reach outside of it, which would mean that if you put an absolute path, I guess, yeah, we would separately have to ban absolute paths. But like, sorry, I'll be quiet now.
But I guess the question is, like, what does the absolute path mean? Because the absolute path could just be a shorthand to the root of the module.
But like, a leading slash already has a meaning in Node, which is the root of the file system. So like, I think if we want to make essentially syntax for the root of the module, which would be awesome, then that needs to be something separate, like tilde or some other bike shed. But like, once that exists, then we could use that.
So one way to restrict it would be to say, effectively for now, your right-hand side has to start with a ./, and if it doesn't, that's a validation error. And then also, if we could either restrict it so that it must resolve within the package, or we could separately not permit dot or dot segments within that right-hand side as well.
Well, we could do both. Like we could assert that it can't have the dots in it. We could assert that it can't be a dot by itself. We can also assert that it must resolve to being within the package. Like the adding those additional constraints just gives us the opportunity to give better error messages sooner, you know, and cheaper.
Right. I think the last constraint is a well-defined consequence of the previous ones, although I may be wrong. You never know. There's lots of obscure rules, but yeah.
Because of symlinks, no restrictions on the string value are actually going to provide those. Like they're actually going to close those edge cases.
So is this something that we should maybe take? Oh, Salah has their hand up. Salah?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we can look at it as we're trying to define the rules for the map, or we could think about it as if there's any folder that has a package JSON that has a main, it cannot be mapped by any other package, because a peer package has sub-packages, and those sub-packages have have mains. Then you shouldn't be able to define a mapping for a folder that has a package JSON with a main in it. I think that should be a rule that should throw whenever any package tries to define anything within its scope that would shadow a sub package in a folder, because that would not have a double dot, and well, it would effectively be defining something that a main should have the priority for.
So are these a few things that we want to maybe sort out before we upstream, or are these things you think are okay to upstream to sort out in the upstream PR?
I feel like if we don't at least approach the PR with some sort of consensus for these things, it's just going to devolve very quickly in the upstream PR.
I'd be happy to address these kinds of questions in the PR, and maybe we can follow up from these discussions in that PR. Yeah, and I think seems like we've got some kind of consensus already on what we think the behaviors should be, so hopefully that shouldn't be too hard.
Okay. So it sounds like, oh, Jan, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, what I was about to say was, if we want to land the first iteration under an experimental flag anyhow, I think it's fair for us to say, here are the following things are currently still being worked out and will be resolved before we remove the flag. Like for me, something like, what are the exact restrictions on the left and right hand side of the exports field is something that we can totally iterate on why that is flagged. And we can just have it as this needs to be resolved before unflagging.
That seems very reasonable to me, especially if what we're talking about right now is mostly related to validation, not to like core behavior.
Sure, I'd be happy to make the PR and then follow up with validation handling as a separate feature that we need to make sure that we handle before any unflagging.
Rob, what were you saying is the conflict?
So I think me and a few others were saying that the key in the exports table, it's like a URL fragment. It's meant to be just like a plain string suffix that comes after the package name, because you're defining like the namespace that lives, the public-facing namespace that lives under the package name. And I think, Jordan, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you believe that it ought to get like fully resolved.
Right, the way that the browser fields worked for 9 years. I think it should work the same way, where it always gets fully resolved, because there's like 16 different ways to hit any one file by typing a 16 different specifiers. So I think that if you force me to say, well, you can do package/foo, or you can, ./foo, or you can do ./foo.js or ./foo/index.js. Like, if you force me to enumerate all those, then my export map gets really large, and the likelihood is that it will create a kind of uncanny valley where people won't actually enumerate all of those possibilities, and then something that would normally axiomatically always resolve in Node won't resolve with every variety when there's an export map. Whereas if the keys are fully resolved, then we're just leveraging whatever CJS or ESM resolution applies or doesn't, and it just follows the same rules.
So I guess the main thing that I'm interested in is that when you're defining your package's exports, you are only defining the public entry points that live inside your package. And the fully resolving it, for example, if you're allowed dots and you're allowed to escape your package, then you would be almost implying that you can redefine any part of the resolver.
Oh, are you saying that you want the entirety of you want essentially the keys in the export map to create essentially a virtual file system that from without is the only paths that are available?
Yes, that was my understanding of how the encapsulation works.
So like if I made a key of ./foo/index.js, does that mean that people from without would be able to get to that with CJS with foo or foo/index or foo/index.js, like as if that was a real file in the file system?
It would. So I don't really want to speak for CJS because I'm happy to just talk about the import. But if you were to specify that fully qualified, so the package name /foo/index.js, then that is remapped as the export dictionary dictates.
Like as opposed, meaning that without the exports map, you're like, maybe I'll restate it. Without the exports map, the effective export map for a package is, it sounds like you're suggesting that it currently should be a list of all file names.
Yeah, that's effectively how, if you don't have an export table, then everyone can just access the raw file names. Yes.
But what I mean is that I could create a virtual, like I could reify the implicit export map that is currently there for everything as every file name that currently exists in the package on the left-hand side and the same value on the right-hand side, let's say. And
for the ESM loader, yes, because there's no extension resolution. So I think that would be equivalent.
I think that would work the same for CJS, because if, like, I guess this is where I'm trying to kind of bring us to, is I think that could work the same for CJS, because if you're essentially describing the file system more or less, then if there is extension resolution, it would apply. Like if your key was foo/index.js, then all of the ways that you would expect to be able to resolve to that path will work without needing to be explicitly specified. So like even in ESM with the files, if I've passed a flag that enables extension resolution. So we still have to answer that question for ESM because we have that behind the flag. So like, I'm saying that, like, if let's say we turn on extension resolution in ESM, then, and I've put foo/index.js or ./foo/index.js in my exports map, then it would make sense to me that I could get to that with ./foo/index and the extension resolution would apply.
So are you suggesting extension resolution? I can accept that if extension resolution is enabled,
Right.
then that would apply to the value of the dictionary.
Well, sure.
But are you going further and saying that it should be applied to when resolving the key as well?
So to the thing somebody is trying to bring in, their import specifier or their require path, I'm saying that thing should have resolution rules applied to it in order to look it up in the left-hand side of the map.
Therefore, effectively, there is kind of like probing. There's multiple attempts to dereference the dictionary to find a hit. Is what you're suggesting?
Yes, which is how the browser field effectively works right now.
I guess I have a mild preference for avoiding that complexity, but I haven't fully gone through all the possibilities.
Okay. Well, so I guess what I've kind of brought myself to the point of is, I think if we do it that way, then we retain the criteria you're interested in, which is that the entirety of the observable files within the package are enumerated in the left-hand side of the exports map. And we also retain the ergonomics that I'm interested in, which is that resolution rules don't have weird, unalgebraic edge cases or whatever, like things that don't matter. Everything just kind of works.
I see. So we've basically just virtualized access to the package's file system.
Yes, exactly. Like, and the right-hand side would be real access, and so then any resolution rules that apply would still apply, or don't. And then the left-hand side would be the virtual file system, essentially, which doesn't need an extension because Node can get all of the parsing hints it needs from whatever the right-hand side is.
Yeah, so I guess it feels a tiny bit complicated, but I feel like I achieved my aims with that. So yeah, okay.
Well, and as Wes has commented, that also would allow us to make the FS module respect that by default. Potentially. That might be a lot more work, and maybe we don't want to do that right away, but like, we could say that if a file if there's an exports map and there's no virtual file on the left-hand side of it, that FS can't get to it.
Right. Yeah, that sounds next level thinking.
Right, and it's very much next level. It's probably out of scope, but it's like, and it's a stronger restriction or guarantee, but that, like, it does leave that door open, which I think interests a number of people on this call.
Jan has their hand up.
Yeah, trying to backtrack a little bit. So the current expectation is that the default of the export map is /maps to /, which means I think what we have skipped so far is the directory mapping, which is just expose this file system prefix as this other file system prefix. And /maps to / is basically exactly the current behavior. The problem with doing expensive or, well, elaborate resolution for the left-hand side is that you lose the explicitness of what your exported things are. So basically, you are opting into refactoring hazards because now you have to also make sure that if you change anything about details of how your exports are defined, that all possible resolutions to that new exports value still work, which seems like that seems kind of contra to what this proposal could provide. And then it's also a matter of, so if you put into the exports key foo/index.js, why would you ever do that instead of just putting into the export map foo? Because like, how many consumers of your package would then go out of the way to write foo/index in, like, well, your package name /foo/index when they could just write your package name /foo? Like, it seems
there's a lint rule that forces that. There's lint rules that force both directions. People have preferences, so people will do both of those things.
Well, but why would that seems like a very broken lint rule when it's about packages, like about bare specifiers /foo. If only /foo exists, then the lint rule really should be fixed. Like it's the same if you would have foo.js right now. Like it's definitely a choice that you made while designing your package. It's not really a lint rule issue at this point.
Sorry, what I meant is that there's lint rules that force consumers to omit or include the index. Some people prefer avoiding it because it's always implicit, and some people prefer including it to be more explicit.
Right, but if the lint rule enforces that on third-party projects that might not make API guarantees about that being a file or a folder, then the lint rule is just broken because it should not force you to.
The lint rule checks the file system, so it actually ensures that that rule only applies when it is a folder.
Right, but that's not what. But exports only applies when it's not a folder. It only applies to bare specifiers.
I see.
And that's also why I believe that resolving based on file system semantics is kind of tricky, because at that point we might not even know a file system. Like the way that exports is currently designed means that you can actually, just from knowing the exports, completely resolve everything. You don't need to check the file system. If we introduce something where it then also checks for symlinks and does redirects of the specifier before the mapping, that makes it a lot harder for a human being to understand what the final URL will be, because it is resolved, then redirected via a symlink, then looked up in an export map, and then you find another symlink. Like, I would rather keep, it's already adding redirection. I would rather keep the redirection as small as possible. And so the current string concatenation semantics for the left-hand side, where it's just package name and whatever is the rest gets concatenated after it. Basically no semantic analysis. It doesn't technically even have to be a valid URL or path character as far as I care. So if you want to have package name / poop emoji, in theory, it would just work no matter what the file system is, because it would never actually hit the file system before it gets the mapping.
It's worth bearing in mind related here, if there's a folder mapping and you have the extensions flag on, it would check the extensions in the new folder against the file system mapping. So that stuff kind of carries through.
Sorry, Guy, could you elaborate? Do you mean right-hand side? Like path?
No, just saying, if you map a folder, say for example you want the root of the package to actually be the dist folder, that the extension flag will still operate through that operation.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so with all that being said, is there any changes to our current plan of upstreaming? It seems to me like it doesn't change our exact plan. We should move forward with what we're planning on doing. And these are things that we would want to see fixed in between, now and unflagging. Is that accurate? I'll take the no one saying anything as approval that that's what we want to do. Great. There's a random question. How are passing the package JSON resolved if the package JSON itself is a symlink relative to the link location or to the real path? Well, Wes, my brain is unfortunately unable to figure that out for you right now. Like Guy just said, package JSON is not real pathed. I would like to suggest that we take the rest of this offline for discussion. And we take the last 13 minutes that we have to discuss two more things really quickly. Issue 28466 from the main repo. This was opened by Gus. And it hopes to expose the promises APIs a little bit nicer within ESM. Because right now, the way in which they're exposed does not allow for like deep searching. Now, I know that there were concerns about some of these patterns originally, and maybe we want to take a slightly different approach than what's been handled here. But I believe that the file system approach wasn't moved forward for security concerns. I'd need James Snell to come in and mention that again. But this got brought up in light of another PR 21551. You can tell by the almost an order of magnitude earlier in issues. This was one that was opened by Jordan Harband in 2018, introducing a namespace for Node Core. And there are, an ongoing discussion about how we should move forward and which specifiers, how we should actually specify the namespaces. I thought maybe we could spend a bit of time discussing people's thoughts here. It was discussed earlier today by the TSC. There's also discussions that have been happening at TC39, as well as within the WICG at W3C, about the kind of namespaces that people are looking to use for built-ins within the JavaScript platform as a whole. So anyone have any thoughts about namespaces in Node Core? Sla, your hand is up.
Yeah, so I think it's going to come up now that a lot of people are looking at the colons notation. It will likely end up making more sense after all the disputes and all the different arguments, that those would actually be registered schemes. And I think there was an issue about that before. But it's really a security aspect that if it's registered, there can only be one of it. So I'll just leave this point, I believe it's going to be the colon notation at the end, so we might as well just explore what it would take to register something. James?
Jan?
Yeah, basically just a very quick, I believe that the namespaces make sense, and I believe that since it, to me at least looks like the browser is going with std colon, the colon variant seems like it would be silly for Node.js to not then follow that precedent. At least that would be my opinion.
Jordan, I know you have some thoughts here. There goes your hand. Yep.
Okay, so I'm still trying to find a room, so I apologize for the noise. But so first, the specific choice of protocol name is something that I think isn't a foregone conclusion and is not something that the language is going to go with. So I think it's likely that browsers will end up making a different choice once the language has selected something different. But certainly browsers are just always going to use a protocol because the only other option would be to follow Node. And I don't get the impression that the folks making those decisions for browsers care too much about the patterns that Node has established. I don't think it would be silly for Node to do something different than browsers as a general statement. I think that Node has a lot of capabilities browsers don't. In many ways, Node is better than browsers. And in many ways, Node should not cripple itself or hamstring itself, rather, just because browsers have done so to themselves. So I'm not very a fan of that argument of like, well, browsers are bad in this way, so we should be bad in this way too. Although obviously consistency across the ecosystem is a good thing, et cetera. So I think that I would, as I opened, as I've commented in that issue many times and discussed with Miles a number of times as well, my preference would be to follow the paved cow path and to use an NPM style scope I think that the like C has sort of shifted such that it's likely that it will end up being a protocol, despite my efforts and preferences. But I think that that will end up being unfortunate, because I think there's a lot of value in overlapping with the node modules space in terms of like polyfilling and things like that. I think those are some thoughts I have.
So the only thing I want to challenge there, Jordan, is the way you framed it. Like, I think it's a little biased to frame it as the browser's making a mistake.
I agree, but there's constant bias in everything many other people are saying that assume that that the browser's way of doing it is automatically better. And so I think that bias needs a bit of combating. I agree that just because Node has done something absolutely does not automatically mean it's good. And the same is true for anything, swap out Node for browsers or TC39 or whatever. The problem is that there's a lot of people that have an implicit assumption that because it's done that way in browsers, it's better. And I think that while that adds value and adds weight, that assumption does not hold, especially in the case of things like things that relate to file systems, because browsers don't have them, like not to the same degree, and they don't have network requests to the same degree, and so Node is just in a different class here, and I think it's appropriate to evaluate whether we need to make different decisions and to very seriously reevaluate if we need to make the same ones.
So the bits that I would say, and obviously we need to reach some degree of consensus on this upstream to have anything happen. Like, we've been discussing this for almost a year and a half now. And it is blocking, it has blocked landing new things. It is not having a namespace has caused us to name modules names that aren't necessarily preferable. And it has arguably gotten us to the space where we are also, having functionality that is less than ideal. If you look specifically at how we're exposing promises, because we don't want to do like fs/, we don't want deep directory searching into modules when we're using the file system to back it. It really feels to me that we are at a point right now where the longer we wait, the more pain we are feeling. And it's, fairly frustrating to me that it's taking so long. Now, what I would like to see if we could is making some level of decision. Independent of our group, there are other groups within the Node project who are interested in using the @Node.js scope to publish modules that are maintained by core. I believe Jeffrey is one of them, and the work that he's looking at doing for contains module syntax is potentially looking at being an ecosystem module as well. I think there's a bigger question about if we should even do that and what modules would exist in that space. But just stating that it is also now blocking those efforts. I absolutely do not think that that we should be making that we should be using the namespace for more than one thing. If we're going to use @Node.js/, we absolutely should not be using it for both built-ins and for externals, which should be for one or the other. And if the browsers and other runtimes, this is not just Node and the browser, but this would be other JavaScript runtimes, are looking at using JS:, for example, as a built-in, we will be getting those built-ins in our runtime. And Jordan, I know that you're saying that you don't think that vendors or the committees would listen. I disagree with that sentiment. I do genuinely believe that if Node were to make a decision here, and it's a decision that aligns with what is currently in the spec process as far as the mechanism being a scheme, I genuinely believe that would be, push people more in the direction of going there. I think it will be very, very weird if we end up having built-in namespaces for JavaScript that are JS:, and all of a sudden Node.js/ is just for the Node built-ins. That's odd. It's weird to have to teach people multiple things. And I understand that we're already talking about teaching them multiple things for the difference between built-ins and ecosystem modules, but those are very distinct things. It's not the same as like, hey, we have this conflated thing that means one thing in one sense and different in others. I really do believe that we should be moving forward with these protocols. Salah?
Yeah, just one point about the @ symbol. It can sometimes, if you're resolving an @ symbol part of a URL, it could be due to some logic problems or very, very well-crafted paths that it would be considered actually a username signifier or something of that effect. So the @ symbol itself, not just a matter of it being, it has all the legacy, but it really becomes problematic if you want to force that now that interop is really within reach. So if people don't take the @ symbol, don't welcome it when, in the browser world, it's not necessarily just because it's Node that is coming with it, but rather for security problems, right?
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're butting up against time, and I'm going to have to drop because I have another meeting. If you could wrap up your point, then we probably need to shut down the call, and we probably should just bring this up again on the next call.
No, that was it. It was just that people will block for security reasons, not just because it's Node. That's all.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining the call. We have, I'm going to drop that issue one more time. If you have thoughts, concerns, please chime in there. I would like to see core move forward on this sooner than later, and it's important that the folks on this call are able to chime in if you have opinions. So thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to end the meeting. Is there any last-minute business anyone needs to bring up?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Everyone have a great long weekend for those of you that have one, and a great short weekend for those of you that don't. Talk to you soon.